So thank you everyone for joining us online. This is our regular meeting for Global Minds for Ukraine, which is a series of online lectures organized by Kyiv School of Economics amidst the war. The main idea of our lectures is to meet intellectuals, scholars, academics from all over the world and discuss important, most pressing issues from their field in the context of what is happening now in Ukraine. My name is Timothy Brick. I'm rector of Kyiv School of Economics, and you can watch all our lectures on our YouTube or listen on podcast on Spotify. Today, we are delighted and very honored to have Alexander Stubb. He's a famous Finnish politician who served as Prime Minister of Finland in 2014 and 15, and he is a director and professor of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. And personally, I would like to plug in and to recommend his recent series of lectures on YouTube by the European University Institute, which cover recent events, which explain and make sense of this war and Russian culture and governance. And Alexander, we are very grateful that you can spare your very valuable time and talk to our audience during these difficult times. So thank you very much, and I'll pass the virtual microphone to you.
Well, thanks a lot, Timothy, and thanks for the invitation. And as you'll know, when I got your invitation, I responded within about 5 minutes or whatever it was. So, I've had the opportunity to plug into the, Kyiv School of Economics. It's a wonderful opportunity as well. And, I feel as honored and as privileged to join you. And I think it's a great idea to, in the midst of all the disorder, to try to find some order, have pretty much regular, Tuesday sessions. And I'm glad that the timing was right. I'm actually sitting in Finland at the moment. And so I guess the time zone is pretty much the same. You're in Eastern European time as well. So it's 7 in the evening over here. Now, you mentioned my sort of lecture series. It's something called Understanding the War, very much spurred on about what's going on in Ukraine. As a result of Putin's and Russians' aggression. And you can imagine that myself as a Finn, I'm taking this very personally in many ways. And the sort of feeling of empathy, sympathy, support, solidarity, it in many ways goes beyond. And intellectually as well, I think most of us have tried to make sense of what's going on. I think what's going on in Ukraine, and I'll just say this by way of introduction before I'll sort of explain what I'm going to do today. The way in which you need to see it and understand it is that there are always these moments in history when something big happens, right? I mean, there might be decades that nothing happens, and then boom, suddenly something big. And as a Finn, or even not as a Finn, but as a European or a Westerner, I think it's easy to identify a few key dates which have changed the world. One being 1917, or 1917, 1918, the end of World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia at the time. Then secondly, 1944, 1945, the end of World War II and the creation of a new bipolar world order, which I'll be addressing today. Then 1989, end of the Cold War, or 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for my generation, I started studying at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. As I say, in 1989, it was a big moment. And now for a lot of our students at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute, it's a similar moment. This is sort of the 1989 moment of their generation, because I believe that the world order is going to change because of what is happening in Ukraine. Now, I've been asked today to talk about the New World Disorder, or power in the 21st century. It's also pretty much the concept of a book that I'm working on, and that the lecture series, Understanding the War, is based on as well. The lecture series is 12 episodes, about 15 minutes each, and quite easy to run through. And it's only my humble way of trying to understand the world from different kinds of perspectives. So I'll talk about a new world disorder with an introduction, then 3 points. How was the world? So the Cold War. How is it, or how was it in the post-Cold War? And then thirdly, how will it be? But by way of introduction, I just want to say that we human beings have a tendency to do three things. One is we over-rationalize the past. So we look at examples from the past to try to understand the present. So that's why a lot of people right now are comparing the Finnish Winter War from 1939 to 1940, which lasted 105 days, to what's going on in Ukraine. I think there are some elements that are similar, but some elements that are dissimilar, but it does help us to understand. Secondly, we have a tendency to over-dramatize the present. Well, in your case, there is no such thing as over-dramatization when your brothers and sisters are dying, for your country and for your existence. But then thirdly, when we quite often over-rationalize the past and over-dramatize the present, what we do then is to underestimate the future. In other words, we don't really think about what's going to happen in the future. Now, in the middle of war, it's difficult to do that. Some people are trying to do it at the moment, but not getting very far. But I'd love to have that conversation as well to understand where this is going to go. So when we talk about a world order, we basically try to make sense of a world, either how we like to see it, or I guess how it is. And I'm trying to look more about how it is. So how to understand and how to organize. We also have to understand that we never live in a perfect world, right? So whatever I talk about now is just a simplification. So point number one, how was it? And here I think my reference point is the Cold War. So let's say 1945 to 1989. Now the Cold War, in my mind, was two things. It was bipolar and it was ideological. So bipolar in the sense that on one side of the fence, you had the United States, which spoke the language of democracy, of capitalism, of freedom. And it had a set of allies, and interests which it tried to protect in a post-World War era. That's why it had troops, for instance, in Europe, and that's why it had different types of proxy wars, if you will, around the world, in Vietnam, in Korea, and elsewhere. On the other side of the fence, you had the Soviet Union and its allies, either voluntary or not. But it was a system that was based on communism, on controlled economy, on autocracy in many ways. And of course, Ukraine was part of that big package, some wanting, some not wanting, and also went through a very horrific period under Stalin and kulakization, and a forced famine. So, what I'm trying to say here is that the world was very bipolar, but there was a real ideological and systemic rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States and their allies. And that was the sort of existence of the Cold War. There was also a very strong deterrence because of nuclear weapons, which we're having conversations about now, where you had a balance of power whereby neither side really wanted to use, because they would understand that this could be basically the end of the world as we know it. So the Cold War was bipolar and ideological. Now, point number two, what happened then after the Cold War? So here I'm talking the period from 1989 to 2022. And of course, I'm going to have to cut corners and simplify. We call it the post-Cold War era, but some might come back at some stage and say that it was the interwar or interwar period. Just like, post-World War I was called the post-World War I era until there was World War I and World War II, and then it came the sort of interim era, if you will. So what was the world like after 1989? So in my mind, it was unipolar, so driven by one superpower, the United States, and at the same time, it ended up being identity driven. And the reason I say this is that there was this sentiment when I started to study in 1989 that there was an end of history, right? That Fukuyama believed, and I think to a certain extent, many of us believed in that, myself included, that now that the sort of battle between ideologies had ended, we saw one ideology won, and that ideology had three pillars, which were liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization. And we also bona fide believed that there were things that integrated or put us together that would in many ways, guarantee, if not eternal peace, at least peace between nation states. The more interdependent you were, the more you traded, the more value change dependency there was, the more travel there was, the more education there was, the more connectivity there was, the less conflict was likely. And this was the whole mentality. So the US was the unipolar player, and we believed in the end of history. I personally believe that the shift in this mentality started and went through three phases, the culmination of which is the fourth one, which is the war in Ukraine. So phase number one was 9/11. This was the first time that we understood that, there are places, organizations, if not countries in this world, which don't accept the liberal world order as we see it. It was a symbolic attack on the Twin Towers by a terrorist organization in the form and led by Osama bin Laden. But this was the moment that people started to understand that, okay, all this talk about freedom, democracy, globalization, liberal values, it's not flying everywhere. The second nail in the coffin of this liberal world order that we witnessed in the post-Cold War era came in the form of the financial crisis, which started with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, which then escalated to a subprime crisis, which escalated to a financial crisis, which escalated in Europe to a euro crisis, which I was very engaged in myself because I was in government from 2008 to 2016 as foreign minister, trade and Europe minister, prime minister, and finance minister. So seeing all of those sort of crises moving. So this was an idea that the financial markets, which I'm sure the Kiev School of Economics you deal with a lot, the financial markets are not self-regulatory enough to be able to cope with big hits, and therefore there needs to be more state involved, more regulation involved, etc., etc. And then, of course, the final nail in the coffin before the war in Ukraine was 2016 with a double whammy in the West, which on one hand was Donald Trump, and the other hand was Brexit. So this was sort of an end of an era, if you will, of a liberal world order, which is now seeing the tail end really happening in a shock in Ukraine. I myself, if I may add, was foreign minister and chairman of the OSCE when the war in Georgia broke out. And because I was chairman of the OSCE, I also mediated peace, first in Tbilisi and then in Moscow, with a 5 to 6 point ceasefire agreement, and which ended up eventually creating two frozen conflicts, one in South Ossetia and one in Abkhazia. But this was the sort of the moment when we should have started to understand that, okay, it's not the end of history. And here we come then to the third phase, or my third point today is, how will it be? Well, to a certain extent, I guess I could argue that symbolically, especially for us in the West, we are seeing the beginning of history with Ukraine, or the return of history, if you will, because once again, we are seeing war on the borders of Europe. We are seeing an aggressive, revisionist, imperialist Russia, which believes in spheres of interest and intimidation and annexation and breaking international law. And the world now, in my mind, has become multipolar. And in that sense, it's much more complex than what it used to be. Bipolarity you can sort of understand conceptually. Unipolarity you can also understand. What multipolarity becomes much more complicated. That's why I call it the sort of era or the age of disorder. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a worse world, but it's just going to be slightly more complicated. And I think for a school of economics, it's also important to understand that there is a pendulum of power that keeps on swinging, right? I mean, it moves from one side to the other. And for your school, I guess the most relevant, measurement here is a pendulum of power between market and state. So when the Cold War ended, it was all about market, right? It was about market reform. It was about liberalization, free movement of goods, services, money, and people. It was about competition policy. It was about trade policy. It was about making money, about liberalizing the market. But actually that shift quite soon started after, a period of hyper-capitalism in the former Soviet Union, of moving very far to the right spectrum of economic policy, I guess, in Europe as well. It started to move back to more state control. And as I mentioned, 9/11 was one of the issues. 2008, the financial crisis was one of the issues as well. Then Donald Trump comes in and disrupts basically value chains, starts talking about America first. Brexit is all about taking back control from those horrible globalist capitalists around the world. Then we had COVID, which is a big hit to the value chain system, and people start looking inward. And of course, now with the war in Ukraine, we understand that food supplies chains, different value chains are very vulnerable to external shocks. So this probably means then that if this pendulum of power keeps on moving, it's also now moving more from global to regional. I'll come back to this in a second. It's also about moving from outward to inward. So I think the world is becoming more decentralized, more flexible, and probably more bumpy. Remember, there was a lot talk about, was it Thomas Friedman who wrote a book called The World is Flat? Well, no, the world is not flat anymore. The world is actually quite bumpy. And here's where I come to my conclusion so that we can move into a good 40-minute discussion. I think we're entering a period of world disorder. Now, I don't belong to the category of people who thinks that this is an era of deglobalization, but it's probably going to be something of a regionalization of globalization. So I think there'll still be strong value chains on the big stuff, but in some issues, it's going to become more regional. Here's where I want to have a conversation with you guys also about, your European endeavors and why I think you should become members of the European Union sooner rather than later, because I believe in these sort of regional constructs like the European Union or like ASEAN or like Mercosur or the African Union as such. I think there'll be also what I call strong poles. So we have a multipolar world, but there'll be one strong pole, which is China, and whatever is around it. There'll be one strong pole, which is the United States, whatever is around it, and linked to that one strong pole or around the European Union. But then there will be big players coming in: India, Nigeria, South Africa, Korea, Japan, Brazil, you name it, coming into the game and trying to find different ways of acting. And I don't think that anyone will dominate this sort of new world disorder. So it'll be, by definition, actually quite messy. There's not going to be a nexus or a center of power. The only wish that I have is that it should be a rules-based world, because what is happening right now and what we're seeing right now with Russian aggression in Ukraine, it's not rules-based. It's not based on the Helsinki Accords from 1975. It's a blatant violation of everything that the United Nations stands for. And if we start breaking the rules, it's very difficult to have any form of an order and then we go into complete anarchy and disorder. So this was what I wanted to say, number one, by introduction, and saying that we over-rationalize the past, we over-dramatize the present and underestimate the future. Then what was the Cold War like? Point number one, well, it was bipolar and ideological. What was the post-Cold War period like? It was unipolar and identity-driven. And what is the world like after the war in Ukraine, whenever it ends? I think it's going to be multipolar, a mix of ideology and identity, where a pendulum of power keeps on swinging. So this is what I wanted to say by way of introduction, and I'm happy to take questions and engage in a conversation.
Thank you, Søren. Thank you very much for this very well structured presentation and clear points in the end. I will start the Q&A, just to warm up and to give our friends in the audience some time to think about questions. Before entering, a real debate or conversation, even though I don't really believe that the Ukrainian audience is going to have any debate about the possibility of joining European Union. I think there is a strong consensus in Ukraine that the country should be a member of this union. I first would like to make a step back and to discuss misconceptions. I think it was a very big point of your lectures that sometimes there are some big misconceptions in how societies or scholars think about each other, and these misconceptions might lead to dramatic results. And you were talking about this catchy phrase, Finlandization, and that it's something that is offered like on the table as a strategy for Ukraine, and you criticize this because apparently it's rather a cliche and misconception. So can you explain to our audience what did you mean by that, and what should we take out from your understanding of it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, misconceptions and misunderstanding and the use of language in international relations is actually quite normal. So you end up either construing the truth, distributing fake facts, or then misunderstanding people. Sometimes it's because of mistakes, at other times it's because you want to misunderstand someone. So the term that you raised is Finlandization, and interesting enough, by the way, if you look at the public discourse at the moment, the people who want to appease Putin, who want Putin to save face, or who believes that Ukraine should give in, etc. They're exactly the same people that talked about Finlandization early on. Now, for someone like me who is an avid transatlanticist, Westernly oriented Finlandization is actually an insult. It's a concept that was invented by a German professor, I think, in 1966, and it was sort of the ultimate concept of appeasement. And it was used as a concept of this is how you can survive next to a big aggressive neighbor. But you see, for us in Finland, it meant, especially in the 1970s, it meant three things. Number one, we were not able to drive the type of international relations or policy or foreign policy that we wanted to do. So we couldn't join the institutions where we wanted to be. EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, is a good example. We couldn't join that because the Soviets wouldn't allow us to do it. So therefore we forged a Fin-EFTA agreement after long reflections. And actually the story has it that our president then, I'll come back in a second, Urho Kekkonen, was there for effing 24 years, right? I mean, we're talking Nazarbayev 2.0 here. So, he was there for a very long time. He got drunk for 2 days after he had taken the decision. It was so difficult for him to do. But the idea was that the Soviets didn't allow us to join the international institutions that we wanted to enjoy. Does that sound familiar to you guys? Soviets or Russia does not want you to join NATO, probably doesn't want you to join the EU either. Secondly, we were not allowed to have free speech, or we were allowed, but it really wasn't. So a book like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which I think is one of the best books ever written, super interesting, well written, and the rest of it wasn't allowed to be published in Finland, it had to be published in Sweden. And we're talking the 1970s here, right? So we're not, this, is not exactly, old history. It's fairly recent history. And thirdly, the Soviets meddled with our internal politics. So we had President Kekkonen because for 24 years, because he was the guarantee of security and good, peaceful relations with the Soviet Union and its leadership. And sometimes politicians were chosen on that basis. So for instance, the party that I happened to have joined in 2004, they were out of government pretty much from 1944 all the way to 1991. And the reason was simple, or was it 1987? And the reason was simple, that they were too Western oriented and too anti-Soviet, if you will. So that's what I'm trying to say. It really, it narrows your room of maneuver. It narrows your freedom to act and interact. And that's what big powers want to do to you. That's what Russia wants to do to you. That's what the Soviet Union wanted to do with us. So Finlandization, as I said from the beginning, I said it on CNN in Amanpur. I said it, on almost every one of the first 200 interviews that I gave to the international media, that do not even suggest Finlandization for Ukraine. It's simply an insult.
Okay, well, I'm happy that we provided you yet one more platform to tell this, and we will spread the word to the Ukrainian audience for sure. Yeah, I just want to let our audience know that we will do some polling. So do not be surprised if you see some polls or surveys in the middle of our conversation. It's just a way of engagement with the audience. And to keep a conversation further, I also wanted to talk about, more practical aspects of your lecture, because you are talking about the future, and the future, as you mentioned, can be prosperous and good for everyone if it's based on some rules. And I guess that rules, they also should be enforced. So I guess my question would be the following: how do you see the law enforcement and international law enforcement in this future world which you described? Do you see any sort of new international organizations like United Nations should be transformed in order to fit into this new reality which is coming? Or do you foresee any other big change in the international area?
Okay, it's obviously a big question, and I'm probably not going to give you a specific enough answer. But put it this way, one of the lectures that I gave in the series, and especially one of the Twitter threads that I gave, was called The West and the Rest. And in that, my basic argument was that the conflict that we have right now is not about Russia and the West. It's also a pretext for the West and the rest. And by this, I mean to say that we are very emotionally attached to what's going on in your country and in Ukraine. We are very frustrated. We are showing solidarity as much as we can. We, by the way, need to talk about war fatigue at some stage as well. But in any case, just for the sake of argument, my argument was that the rest of the world isn't. So what happened was that we saw a vote in the UN, which was 141 condemning Russia, 35 abstaining, and 4 supporting Russia. Syria, Eritrea, Belarus, and North Korea, or whatever it was, right? But my point was that the 141 votes, that's great, but it was a soft 1-for-1. So it was last day scrambling. I talked to a lot of my friends in the UN and ambassadors and others, so they had to scramble the votes. 35 countries, including India and China, represented, and they abstained, over half the world's population. And when you started to scrape the surface and you started to look at the debates in, say, the Middle East or the Gulf region, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, you suddenly noticed that there wasn't that much sort of solidarity and support. It was very much a mentality that, listen, this is your war, right? Europe has been the source of 2 world wars, and now you're asking us to help. It wasn't a lack of sort of emotional attachment or to Ukraine, but there was this resentment of what the West had done. And this comes back to your question of the New World Order. You see, something like the UN has been created in the image of the victors of World War II, right? So you have in the Security Council original members were the US, the Soviet Union, France, and the UK, and then later on China came in. Now, a lot of the Nigerias and Indias and Japans and others are asking, why are we not there? My solution would be to have regional-based, conglomerations, but it's a bit unrealistic. Also, the world order that was created, the bipolar world order that was created post World War II, was about the Bretton Woods, so IMF, World Bank, well, Western institutions. It was about the GATT, which then became the WTO, Western institution. It was about strong other institutional constructs, NATO and the EU. Well, they were also Western. So the whole system was created in the image. And in Africa, you have a lot of non-aligned countries that have affiliations with Russia. So, my bottom line here is, and I'm not trying to push the arguments of the Indias and Chinas of this world, but my argument is that we have to understand in the West that this is probably the end of our domination. And that's why I'm saying that pushing values only is not going to work. What you're going to have to push is a rules-based system. Do we need to create new institutions for that? Well, obviously there have been attempts in the forms of G7, then which became G8 and is now G7 again, G20, etc. But they are not true international institutions because they are based on nation states. So that's why my answer is not going to be complete to you. But I think that we just in the West need to understand that the war in Ukraine is going to be another step in a world which is not going to be created fully in a Western image.
Yes, yeah, thank you for this answer. And there were some other questions in the chat on Facebook that were touching the same issue, so I'm not going to come back to them, but there is another question in the Q&A here on Zoom. Yaroslav Filuk, he's asking a quite intriguing question about Russia, and what he says is that we need to admit that Russia is the last empire of the modern world, and it consists of a variety of different people and regions, as he say, captured by Moscow during its history. So basically the question is, what do you think about the idea of Russia's disintegration? Can it happen? And how would you react to this statement and the idea of disintegration?
So to make Russia even smaller than the Soviet Union, the CIS in the olden days. Yeah, I mean, this is a last grasp of an empire, or a country, or at least a leader, which has fallen into the fallacy of superpower nostalgia. I mean, the size of the Russian economy in the world today is less than 2% of world GDP, and reducing. So we're talking about a country which has the greatest natural resources in the world, which is the greatest geographic area, but has the size of an economy of the Netherlands or Spain. So smaller than actually, for instance, the Nordic countries put together, the 5 of them. So we're talking about a minuscule, and I call this always the curse of natural resources, or in the Russian case, obviously 50% of the state economy roughly comes from gas and oil exports. And when you have that privilege, you are unable to renew. And then the question is, okay, how do you do it? Because what people often look at is, okay, how can I improve the aggregate wealth of the population? But in Russia, quite often it has been, how can I improve the aggregate wealth of the governors, the president, the oligarchs, etc., etc. So is it, are we going to start seeing a split? I don't know, because I understand and have studied Russian history, but when you start coming to region, I think it's going to lose Central Asia because of this, from its sphere of interest, not from the Russian Empire as such. And we've already seen fairly heavy pushback from them. Ukraine is lost forever, right? So and in that sense, it's very, very clear for everyone to see, and I think Putin and his regime, they were driven by this sort of almost desperate action for showing their might, and in many ways to Europe it did have previously two things that it could intimidate with. One was economy and energy, and the other one was military might. Now it only has military might left because Russia is going to be fully and utterly isolated, politically, economically, financially, sport, culture, energy, transport, travel, you name it. And this is going to be a state of affairs for a long time, and only because Putin wanted to create back Russia. It's almost like Donald Trump, make Russia great again kind of a thing. So one language, Russian, one religion, Orthodox, one leader, Putin. And he did a huge strategic and tactical mistake, actually mixing the two. And whatever he wanted to do, the exact opposite happened. As I said, Europeanization of Ukraine, unification of Europe, revitalization of the transatlantic partnership, rejuvenation of NATO, and the icing on the cake is, of course, Finnish and Swedish NATO membership, which would have never happened. And I've always been an advocate, but it would have never happened. So, all I can say is sort of personally, spasibo Putin. It's just, it's that's what he did. So will this then lead to the dismantling of Russia, Dagestan, Chechnya? I don't know. I really don't, not qualified to give you an answer on that, but certainly things looking from the Kremlin perspective didn't go as planned, did they? But may I add, this would have not happened had he walked into Kiev in 48 hours. I think the reaction of the West would not have been as adamant as it has been. If you guys hadn't picked up arms, if you hadn't fought as heroically as you, this would be a completely different kettle. It would be Georgia 2.0, it would be Crimea 2.0, and then it would be just Donbass 2.0, So there you go.
Yes, absolutely. That's what we also feel from here. I mean, we had to convince a lot of international partners to support us. Even now, we still have to do a lot of efforts on the international arena to convince to push on sanctions, on military support. So yeah, we know the drill. So talking about relations with the West and with international partners, and this future of European integration of Ukraine into European Union, is there anything specific? Yeah, we can jump from more abstract conversation to some more specific and concrete stuff. Is there any specific steps that Ukraine should do right now in order to be better integrated into European Union, maybe at the level of some policies that should be changed, or government practices, or even culture of making decisions? So do you see any specific things that should be done?
Okay, I'll give you a macro answer and a micro answer, because I presume you're an economist. So the macro answer is to use the momentum, because what we will see now is Europe split into two, with on one hand an isolated revisionist, imperialist, authoritarian Russia, which I mentioned earlier, and the other side you have, I say, roughly 40 European states which are democracies, seek integration, cooperation, and abide by international law. And because this is the new reality of Europe, I say 40 because I want to include Turkey in that, but it's a bit on the fence at the moment. I want to include Armenia and Belarus, but they are not democracies in the, certainly not Belarus. So you can't do that. So you have this sort of club of democracies which has different memberships, right? I mean, some are in NATO, some are not. Some are in the EU, some are not. Some are in both, some are in neither. Some want to be in both. Some don't want to be in either. So it's sort of a mixed bag. So what I'm trying to say to my European friends, as someone who is an advocate of EU enlargement, is that we should see EU enlargement not anymore as a technical exercise. Of course, you need to take care of your rule of law. I mean, the issue that pops up quite often in Ukraine is state stability and corruption. These types of issues that need to be ironed out in a system. You need to make your legislation as compatible to the legendary acquis communautaire or 100,000 pages of it. But you need to see, I think, enlargement as a strategic issue. And for me, then enlargement becomes what I call a 5+3+1. So 5 Western Balkan states, I spoke to Western Balkan diplomats. They are doing an executive training with our school at the moment today. And then the 3 means Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And then finally, the 1 means Turkey. So there needs to be an absolutely clear path towards EU membership. And we need to start create common institutions, sort of pre-institutions. So summit meetings twice a year, ministerial meetings a couple of times a year. Then when you start the accession negotiations, let people into working groups, not with voting rights as such, but just to socialize into the system. And I think this is the best way to do it. And in many ways, I think the Western Balkans and of course Georgia and Moldova should be thankful for the fact that you are doing the groundwork in the war. This would have again not happened was it not for the war, because there was certain enlargement fatigue. So just prepare as much as you possibly can and use the political momentum. Because I remember conversations when I was prime minister when people were questioning the Europeanness of Ukraine. Now no one is questioning that anymore.
Yeah, I also I think it's a kind of tragic irony that we now preparing this ground for other societies, but I mean, we live in a global world, and I think we all doing something. How, as you said, that we have this audience of economists. Yeah, we can talk about it in terms of positive externalities. Yeah, some outcomes of what we do. Yeah,
exactly.
And I was intrigued by what you mentioned. You were saying something along the lines of educational programs for executives, and we also strive to build some educational programs. But can you just talk about your experience in a way? It's a bit a counterintuitive idea here in Ukraine that you can actually teach things like I don't know, Euro integration or building institutions. There are 2 common ideas that are very popular in Ukraine. And one is that it's about generational replacement. There are some generations of people who grew up in the Soviet Union or were educated in a specific culture, maybe the culture of the difficult transformations during the 90s. Yeah. So, and maybe these people simply cannot create necessarily change. So we just need to wait for generational replacements, so new people will come and change the world. And another idea is basically that you can bring people from abroad, sort of idea of modernization. You can just take institutions or organizations that are successful and you outsource everything to them. So it seems that what you do is neither. You just build some sort of educational programs to change people, to change governance. And can you speak about it? Do you believe that is this really possible to educate civil servants or businessmen or citizens to to feed this future world that you were talking about in the beginning of your lecture?
Sure. I'll probably give you 2 answers. One is to pitch a little bit what we do, because actually we've accepted a lot of Ukrainian students and fellows, not least due to the war, but they're coming to us, the ones that can. So basically the School of Transnational Governance is 5 years old. The European University Institute is much older. But we are sort of a wannabe Kennedy School of Government, if you will. And the basic idea is that we do transnational governance, which means that we look at governance beyond and below the borders. So we believe that governance is not centralized anymore to civil servants or governments, that there is business involved, the private sector, NGOs, journalists, academics, civil society, and decisions are not born in a vacuum. That's why we have ESGs in a lot of companies. That's why they are very adamant about their reputational risk, and that's what basically transnational governance means. We have 4 pillars in the work that we do. One is a master's program. It's a 2 years master's program with internships and exchanges. Secondly, we have fellowships. We have an Africa fellowship program, global fellowship program, and then senior and visiting fellows. And then thirdly, we have executive training run by George Papakonstantinou, who is a former finance minister of Greece. So him and I were on the opposite sides of the fence during the financial crisis. He was actually the guy who found the statistical mistakes in Greek state accounting. And so he was in there 2008, 2009, really taking the big hit, if you will. He's a brilliant economist. And then thirdly, we have events. So that's what we do. But the reason I do that pretext is to give my second point, is that we actually believe in lifelong learning. And of course, some older people see that as a threat, that, this is replacement and the rest of it. I actually believe in reverse mentorship. So, my kids around here, they teach me a hell of a lot about what's going on in their world, which is in many ways much more real world than mine. So we are also establishing an executive master's program. So that means that we believe that in the future, education is not going to be only packaged in a bachelor's degree and a master's degree or a PhD, but it could be you do a bachelor's degree, then you start working, and at some stage I want to do a master's, but you do an executive master's on the side of your real job. And we don't see this in any which way as a threat. It's just a way of us human beings to stay on par with what's going on in the world, because I think a lot of careers nowadays are going to be a hell of a lot patchier than what they used to. I mean, I'm not going to work for Toyota for 40 years, at an assembly line anymore. I'm going to have a very big variety of different types of jobs. It, of course, depends on what you do. I mean, you and I are, if I may, information managers. So we are in front of a screen most of the day, putting numbers and letters into some kind of an order, and then we communicate them to other human beings, either on the screen or live, and try to make sense of the world. But the bottom line here is that we need to be trained all the time and learn new things. And that's I guess, our mentality. So I've heard that you're also doing some executive training, and I think that's excellent. And if you feel that, you might need some help from our side on teaching, say, European regulation or European institutions or things like that, I'm sure we're more than glad to help.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for this support. We do have some questions running in the chat, and the same person who asked you about Russia and the Russian disintegration is now also interested about some specific new alliances in Europe, because you were talking a lot. You already presented the landscape of what was going on, but this person asked specifically a question about the role of France, about newly arising alliances in Europe, like Great Britain, Ukraine, and Poland, announced before the full-scale invasion, or recently announced Great Britain, Finland, Sweden, Norway alliances. And in opposite, you can think about Germany and France as two countries that are perhaps having weaker position in terms of international enforcement and security. So perhaps you can comment something specifically about these countries and possible developments with their alliances.
So France, more specifically, or which country did you want? I didn't understand the question well enough.
Okay, so the question is very broad because it speaks about several groups of countries, and I guess what I feel from this question is that there is, again, it's a question of conceptions or misconceptions. There is a conception about three countries: Great Britain, Germany, and France, and it seems like they now have different strategies of reaction to what is happening now in Ukraine. Yeah, Great Britain is
Sure.
more proactive. Yeah,
Sure.
Germany has its own history, France its own history. Can you comment on these
Yeah.
three countries?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. First of all, don't underestimate the others. You know, they are in the driver's seat. So was it not for your Nordic friends or your Eastern and Central European friends, I think that the response to the ongoing war would not have been as strong as it has been. Now, it's easy to simplify, but I'll try not to be too brutal or too unfair. So you could say that the United Kingdom, out of the three countries that were mentioned, has been a strong advocate and a supporter, sent military arms, etc., etc. But there's also a big difference in rhetoric and reality, protecting oligarchs in London and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of high moral standing coming from Boris Johnson and his gang. I can say this because 75% of my family are dual nationals, British and Finnish. And I can also say it because the Americans are quite pissed off with the Brits of trying to take the moral high ground on stuff that they, really haven't done. But put it this way, they are at least, strongly on your, and they don't belong to the appeasers. If this was a binary issue of appeasers and warmongers, if you will, they are certainly not the appeasers. Then Germany is more complex because there, I think the beginning looked very good. There was Scholz's speech about Zeitenwende, so turnaround, and it looked very good in the beginning that they're going to bump up their military and they're going to help out and they're going to send arms, etc. But then at some stage it became Zeitenslalom, right? So they started to go, we won't do this. And now again, the latest speech that I saw just today was saying we're going to be the greatest supporter. So it's a difficult, but you have to understand that there's a historical culture. I add a little parenthesis. Germany was able to deal with its Nazi past, right? It's had that on its shoulder. The Soviet Union, and especially Russia, was never able to deal with its past. I mean, the fact that someone like Stalin is still a hero in Russia is beyond me. I mean, he's a worse killer than Hitler was, if you will, in terms of numbers and et cetera, et cetera. So Russia never dealt with the past. The Germans did that quite well, and now they're started to come into sort of fruition. The final and third category here is France, and that's a bit more complex. I feel actually quite uncomfortable with what Macron has been saying. Bona fide, I think it was okay to try to mediate before the war started, and it's important to keep the conversation going. But at the same time, to say that Putin needs to save face, we need to help him to save face, I think that's bullshit. It's where they thinking at the end of World War II that we need to save Hitler's face. No, there's no such thing. They are the aggressor, and some people don't understand that the only thing that Putin understands is power and might. And there's this old Stalin saying, if you have a bayonet, if it's soft, push in, if it's hard, pull out back. So he needs to pull back and understand that. So there's no room for appeasement here. Does this mean that we should abandon all peace mediation? No, of course not. We should continue dialogue, but anytime you show weakness to Putin, he's going to hit harder. So that's why it's a careful balance. May I add just one final point on this? And the big worry I have, and I said this to a delegation of MPs, Ukrainian MPs in Davos at the World Economic Forum 2 weeks ago. I'm really worried about war fatigue, right? So we're now, over 100 days into the war. Yes, our news are still full of, Russian atrocities in Mariupol or bombs flying in Kiev, et cetera, or rape and murder and pillaging and so on and so forth. But I sense in the general European public a certain war fatigue, because this sort of campaign has been driven by the general public. We are out there on the streets showing our support to Ukraine. It's the Ukrainian flag. I mean, I live in Florence, normally 15,000 people. I was out there giving a speech on the stage, and the mayor of Florence, and the public is with you. But now we're coming to the stage when they start thinking about inflation, about low growth rates, therefore stagflation, unemployment, high energy prices, high food prices, the refugee situation, which has been really well contained so far, in comparison to 2015. So we have to warn against this, and that's why I've told all of my friends in Ukraine that you really have to pitch your communication correctly right now to keep up the pressure.
Yeah, it's a very important point, and I remember you stressed this in your in some of the previous answers. Yeah, you said that eventually we should talk about it. So yeah, I agree. This is a very crucial aspect, at least in what we do now here. We have several projects to support Ukrainian students abroad. Some of them are displaced and they need help. And usually in the context of Western university, students and scholars, they receive some sort of a short-term, immediate support. But we're really afraid that this fatigue can then lead to abandonment of academics, and that they will feel more as abandoned and refuge. So that's why we're trying to institutionalize this support, and we sign memorandums of understanding, and we try to instead of just fundraising, and ask for ad hoc support, we try to build up new institutional ways to support them, to secure budgets and etc. But this is just a tiny thing. Obviously, we should think about it in many other aspects, in humanitarian aid, in military aid, in political aid. So you're absolutely right. And we are on the same page here. So we actually had some more questions in the chat, but most of them, they were touching those topics which you already discussed. I think, we spent an amazing hour with you. Thank you very much for, sparing your time, even though you have some quality family time with your kids and family. Thank you for spending this hour with us as well, and we hope to meet you soon in Kiev, in peaceful Kiev, and have this conversation in person.
I'd love to come. I've been in Kiev once, actually. I think I was foreign minister, trade minister at the time, and I'd love to come again at more peaceful times. I think it would be lovely to do that, and to come there in person. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been interesting, and let us know if you can help in any which way.
Absolutely. And to our members of the audience, I want to remind you that there will be some polling, so please don't leave immediately. And to here is it. There are some polls. And I'm not allowed to vote as a panelist, maybe, not to bias the outcomes.
Yeah, and Finland lost 10% of its territory in World War II in a very uncomfortable peace. We lost Karelia as a region, and then out of the big cities, Viborg, which was the second biggest, 400,000 internal refugees, and including the places where my dad was born and where my grandparents were born.
Yeah, well, there is a sense of disagreement. Most of them, it's a small sample, but most of our audience don't like to contemplate this idea.
I'm with you. I'm not voting either. I'm just looking.
Yeah, I'm curious. Well, well, yeah, I think it's quite intuitive idea that there is a consensus that some regime change must happen. Oh, well, you might like this one. It's your favorite topic.
Tough questions.
Let's see what they say. Well, there is some split, so you still need to talk about this. You still, I think, need to do more convincing to explain people.
I see where you're coming from. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time.
No,
I think
thanks for
that's it.
having me, and have a nice evening, and you know, hopefully we'll get to peace at some stage.
Of course. Thank you.
Keep fighting. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.